Okay, it looks like we're streaming now. So I think we are ready to begin. Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's go. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Paloma Garner, and I'm the College Access Coordinator at Northside High School. I'm also the co-chair of the TASFA. Today is September 30th, 2020, and the time is 10:02 a.m. I would like to call the Texas Application for State Financial Advisory Committee meeting to order. This meeting is being held via Zoom. Please be aware that although we are meeting via Zoom, this meeting is still being broadcast via the internet as an open meeting. We will now take a roll call of committee members to confirm quorum is present to conduct the meeting. Okay, so Shannon Venezia. Shannon, are you here?
I'm here.
Okay. Courtney Balderas.
Here.
I think. Abraham Diaz.
Here.
Lauren Disher.
Here.
Dimitra Durham. Okay. Philip Fabian.
Here.
Victoria Graham.
Here.
Don Hilton.
Here.
Gordon Lipscomb.
Here.
Ines Lopez. Ines. We'll come back to her. Ariela Martinez. Angelica Melendez. Melendez, sorry, not Melendez. Angelica Melendez. No? Tammy Mitchell.
Hey, I'm here.
Okay. Judith Monsivais. No. Crystal Nicholson.
Here.
Fred Peña. Aaron Porter.
Here.
Erica Ramos.
Here.
Lisa Ann Schoenbrunn. Lisa Ann, no. Ed Turney.
Here.
Osiel Vasquez.
Here.
And just to check one more time, Dimitra Durham, are you here? No. Ines Lopez. Ariela Martinez.
I'm here.
Oh. Hi,
And I
Ariela.
see the video for Inez Lopez.
Oh, you see her on there? Okay.
I see the name.
Her
I'm not
name
sure.
is on there.
Yeah.
Okay. Ines, are you here? Angelica Melendez, are you here? I don't see her. Judith Monsivais.
Judith isn't going to make it today.
Okay, thank you. And Fred Peña, did he join us? Okay, or Lisa Ann, I didn't see her either.
We have Dimitra Durham joining.
Yay. Okay, hi Dimitra. Okay, so please record in the minutes that we have a quorum. I'm going to go ahead and review the meeting guidelines. This meeting is being live streamed via YouTube. Please mute your microphone when not speaking. For this open meeting, we ask that you always keep your camera on. A quorum will be established via roll call. Identify yourself prior to speaking for the record. We ask that you wait for one person to finish before speaking. Otherwise, comments may become muddled or unclear. Should the conversation become unmanageable, we will use the raise hand feature. This can be found if you click on participants icon and you'll see 3 buttons toward the bottom of the list. Please raise your hand and lower your hand after you've had time to speak. We will only use this feature as needed. For this meeting, motions will be voted on by raising your hand in the camera and saying aye in favor or no if opposed. THECB staff will monitor emails at the email address listed on the slides and will address questions related to the agenda item. Are there any questions? Okay, having none, we're going to go ahead and move on to agenda item 2. And agenda item 2 is consideration of approval of the minutes for our September 9th, 2020 meeting. Now, please take a few minutes to review the minutes that were sent to you a few days ago, yesterday maybe, via email, and let us know if there are any changes or edits. I'll give you a minute now. Do I have a motion for approval of the minutes?
Erica from,
Oh, sorry.
it's okay, go for it.
Tammy from SFA. I say go for it. Approve them.
Thank you, Tammy. Do we have a second?
Erica from the Valley, I second.
Okay, members, by a show of hand, raise your hand whether you're voting or against. Those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Okay, motion passes based on vote, and we're going to move on to agenda item number 3. So agenda item number 3 is updates from the Higher Ed Subcommittee. We will now move to hear updates from the Higher Education Subcommittee. You all have received a document via email with the recommendations and considerations. Our colleague, Courtney Valderas Jacob, will you go ahead and provide an update for us?
Yes, so if y'all want to follow along, our specific recommendations are on page 3 of that document. So we recommend switching, when switching to the TASFA, that we use the standardized version of the TASFA form from College for All Texans as the template for the first year. See how that goes, and then adjust the second year as needed. We also recommend that we keep the signature process in the same way that our other subcommittee had looked at, is keeping the signature process as simple as possible while still ensuring that there's a consideration of managing fraud. And then for first-time freshmen, TASFA applications should follow behind the admissions application so that we can avoid the application being forgotten or being completed too soon, or just sitting and not being passed along to the institutions that they're applying to, right, and admitted at. And then in order to avoid confusion, lost applications, we recommend that students include their school ID when selecting the institutions to send their TASFA to. And then finally, we recommend that the Higher Education Coordinating Board continue to make the paper TASFA available each year, and that institutions are required to accept either the paper or the TASFA, not the requirement of solely the TASFA. Does anybody else from the committee want to add anything that I may have missed?
Thank you, Courtney. We'll go ahead and move on to agenda item 4, which is updates from the student-focused subcommittee. Erica Ramos is going to provide that update, and I just, Claudette Jenks sent an email just a few minutes ago with the actual updated document that we should be reviewing. The information contained in the recommendations she sent initially did not include that. So Erica, you want to take it away?
Yes, ma'am. Okay. So based on what the student-focused TASFA subcommittee put together, we recommended that institutions should be required to accept at least one of the following formats, which is the TASFA or the PDF paper TASFA. And that format, if the students were to send the PDF TASFA, that application should either be accepted by email or some sort of electronic format, or even also by mail. And whatever option the institution chooses should be clearly and readily visible on the institution's main financial aid website page. We also recommended that the TASFA be created in both English and Spanish, and inserting a choice of language as the first section or question of the application, that there be qualifying questions placed at the beginning of the TASFA that ensure that they are completing the correct application. After the qualifying questions, we recommend that a confidentiality statement be featured in large bold font and recommend requiring a checkbox after that statement in order for them to be able to continue on with the application. And a statement in regards to FERPA can or should be included as well. We also recommended that the TASFA questions should mirror the PDF TASFA application, and we don't recommend utilizing predictive or smart logic to avoid confusing students or parents if and when they change their answers. We also recommend that the TASFA should include helpful pop-ups labeled as hints, perhaps, which can explain the question or the section. And thankfully, these hints and tips are already at the beginning of our PDF TASFA. When it comes to submitting signatures, we recommended using 2 signature boxes that can hopefully be found at the end of the application, one for the student, one for the parent, and that they can sign by using their mouse to create a signature, or that they be allowed to use some sort of box that they can each check mark and then type in their name. We also recommended that an upload portal be created in Apply Texas where students and or families can utilize to upload and submit any supplemental documents. We recommend that higher institutions accept all of the following supplemental documents, regardless of the preferred method of submission, whether they choose eTASFA or PDF TASFA, that the Texas Residency Affidavit be a supplemental document, the Selective Service Verification Card, if required, to be submitted at any time before enrollment without some sort of penalty, hold, or delay in processing that application. A copy of assigned income tax, if available, or tax transcript. And if there is no income tax available, that a notarized non-tax filing statement or letter be also accepted. In order to adopt future changes to the TASFA, we recommended that the Higher Education Coordinating Board can continue to work with our advisory board to request recommendations and changes over the next 2 years. This would then cover our board's current 3-year term. And perhaps a suggestion box can be incorporated in the homepage of the website. A general email account can also potentially be created, allowing the community and the stakeholders to submit those suggestions or recommendations. This board can then review those emails, and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board can also post on social media platforms, send annual or biannual emails to higher education institutions and school districts statewide, promoting this option to actively ask for input. And that is what we have. I really hope I wasn't muted.
No, we heard you. Thank you, Erica. Okay, so we're about to move into the bulk of the work we're trying to do today. October is tomorrow, rapidly approaching, and so we'd like to kind of nail these recommendations as close to solid as possible today. And so what we're going to do right now is take a 5-minute break so that you all make sure that you have these recommendations in front of you visible, because after the break, I'll be sharing my screen and we're gonna just try to nail these things down for agenda item 5. Okay, so I know it's early and we've only been meeting for about 15 minutes, but we're gonna take a little 5-minute break for everybody to review those recommendations so we can get this work done. The time is 10:16 and we'll resume at 10:21. Okay, hopefully everybody has had enough time to get those documents open. And we are going to move on to agenda item 5. Agenda item 5 is the discussion of proposed draft recommendations. It's 10:21. So during the last meeting, Claudette provided a rough draft of proposed recommendations. They included 1, establish the paper TASFA to use as the standard. 2, require institutions of higher education to use the online or coordinating board developed TASFA to verify specific student eligibility for state financial aid. 3, provide funding for the development and maintenance of this online TASFA. It was also suggested that the recommendations from the high school and higher ed subcommittee recommendations be included. So you should have the handout that we were referencing in your meeting materials labeled draft recommendations. This will include the recommendations from the high school subcommittees and from the higher ed subcommittee. Okay, the committee will now discuss these recommendations and consider what recommendations from higher education subcommittee and refine the wording from the student focus committee. And we'll revise what should be included. Okay, Claudette's going to provide an update on the next steps.
Thank you, Paloma. So I wanted to start off by applauding all your work in this committee so far to date. I don't know if you all realize, and you probably do, this committee has met 4 times in 3 months. So that is amazing considering these are open meetings, and we had processes that we had to put in place in order to get the agendas. And so this committee has moved very quickly. So I do want to applaud you, for all your work. The subcommittee work groups have done a great job in setting the stage of what recommendations should move forward. And in our discussions, in your discussions over the last few meetings, there have been some common themes. And I think in both the subcommittee reports, you may have heard those. So as Paloma mentioned, now is the time that you all are going to be discussing these recommendations, fleshing them out to come to at least a few minimum recommendations that can go to our board and continue on to the legislature. If you're unable to do that, you may miss the cycle of providing these recommendations to our board. So today's goal is to flesh these out, agree to a minimum set of recommendations, and the committee can continue meeting to discuss some of these things. But as Paloma mentioned, we have to get these recommendations done today. So she'll be putting up the recommendations that are all in one document from both the committees and some of the recommendations that I put forth last meeting, but also wanted to go back and revisit the statute. Section 61.07762, which defines the application, or is a statute for the application for state financial aid. If you look at section A1, the board shall appoint an advisory committee composed of financial aid personnel and institutions of higher education and stakeholders who represent the needs of interested students to assist the board in adopting the procedures required by the development of the TASFA, or the online TASFA, and to develop recommendations for that purpose. So I wanted to remind you that this is the guidance that we have as far as the statute, and I wanted to make sure that as you move forward in the recommendations, you remember that this is what the goal is, to support and provide recommendations to the legislature by January 1, 2021. And so in order to get those approved, we have to go to our board by October 22nd. We're trying to get a little bit more leeway, but I think because everything is on a timeline and everyone's trying to meet the timelines, today's the day that you have to flesh out a few. So after your review of the recommendations from the high school side, or the student focus side, and the higher ed side, I think there are some common themes that you can put together to create some solid recommendations. So please, everyone on the call today, make sure you voice your opinions. We've had a lot of subcommittee work that I'm sure you've provided some feedback, but today's the day you have to let Paloma know what is moving forward to the to our board for approval. So if you have any questions, please let us know now and we'll proceed.
Thank you, Claudette. So I'm going to share my screen at this time. And what I've done is, because there's so many parallels, I've kind of put the recommendations in 3 columns so that maybe that are aligned by subject, so that maybe we can go through line by line and figure out the wording, or just kind of solidify it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, are we good? Can y'all see my screen? Thumbs up? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So the student subcommittee, let's make this a little fuller. Oh no, that's too much. Their first recommendation, the student focused subcommittee, was that institutions should be required to accept at least one of the following TASFA formats: Texas e-TASFA, PDF paper TASFA, and that these options must be readily visible on the website, because many of us know sometimes it's difficult to find the accepted format. The higher ed recommended almost the same thing. They'll continue to make the paper TASFA available each year, and institutions are required to accept either the paper or participate in the e-TASFA. So that's basically the same. And that's the same as Claudette had written: require institutions of higher education to use the online or coordinating board developed TASFA to verify student specific aid. The only thing missing from that one is accepting the paper. So do we want to discuss that now so we can kind of clarify?
Well, I think we definitely need to add the paper to our final version, because for some of us, if our recommendation to fund this isn't approved by the state, there's no way for a lot of our institutions to be able to fund the e-TASFA. So we definitely need to add paper TASFA, in my opinion, to our final recommendation.
Agreed.
Okay, so does anybody have a preference on the wording here, on which we want to use?
This is Victoria Graham. One recommendation that is on the student side, if we could incorporate just the actual words PDF, so that students can submit a PDF form, just so they don't have to mail it in. If that can be incorporated, I think that would be really, really, really beneficial to the student to have that option.
So Victoria, you're saying specifically that a student can submit via electronic format, not through paper?
Well, I think they can, yeah, submit the current through a PDF, through like email or some other system, but yes.
Okay, so I'm going to add the word electronic PDF. I don't know if that's necessary, but just versus
and this may be a question for Claudette, because there is a separate committee on the TASFA, so the existing TASFA that develops the, I guess what we call the paper application. That application is not developed in a fillable PDF format. It's provided to institutions just in a flat, uneditable format. I know some institutions will recreate it as a fillable PDF document, but it doesn't come from the coordinating board that way. So and I'm not sure that this committee can make a recommendation on the paper application, but if we can, it may be appropriate to insert that the paper application should be provided as a fillable PDF. But I think the main intent of this recommendation is to say that schools should continue to have the option to use the application the coordinating board provides in a non-electronic format, or this new online. So we might be getting into the weeds on the fillable PDF and crossing committee recommendations. But I think the main intent is to say schools should be able to continue using the state provided paper application, or they can use this online application.
Okay, I like that.
This is Tammy, and I may be wrong, and Victoria can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Victoria was just trying to say they can send it electronically if the student chooses via email or some downloadable system. I don't think she meant the fillable PDF. I don't think that was the intent, but I could be wrong. Victoria, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, yeah, that was actually my intent. My intent was just how the student can submit it, just to give them more options in the actual wording to submit it as a PDF. So the ownership would still be on the student to fill it out and save it as a PDF on their own. I'm just saying that they could submit it in that format.
A consideration with that is what information is on the application and whether the school has a secure email function. So I know we have limitations on what we'll accept or what we direct students to send by email because our email is not secure. Or it's not considered secure. So mandating that it be accepted by email if a school can't guarantee the security of the information may be something to consider or caution against. And I know like these students, they may or may not have a social security number, but they do have name, date of birth, email address. A lot of that information can be used in identity theft. So just something to consider.
So I wanted to make a recommendation. Remember, these are high level. You could probably separate these into recommendations and then considerations, as you mentioned, Erin, kind of taking all of these things and putting them in a considerations paragraph as you think through these recommendations. But it would be, if you're going to consolidate, I like how you have this, Paloma, with consolidated, taking the consideration of the student and the student focus and the higher ed committee and putting them into one. So if you want to work off of the language that's all the way to the right, that might be a good start in saying this is what the recommendation is and go from there. So I like the wording changes. In the higher level context, it would be the paper form rather than getting into the weeds about these specific things, because remember, these are recommendations, and then you can put those into considerations of here's some things to think about for the fillable, as you mentioned about sending things electronically, because remember, these are high level recommendations to the legislature. So I'm just trying to make sure we have that context that just not get into to have these thoughts and put them in considerations bucket, but the recommendation should remain at a really flexible level, which is what you have. If you want to add the paper version of the paper TASFA, that would be helpful.
Okay, so what do you all think about require institutions of higher education to use the online or coordinating board developed TASFA or paper TASFA to verify specific student eligibility for state financial aid? And then add those other things we discussed under consideration.
That's good.
And just to let you guys know that the TASFA there is a fillable form on the website or the College for All Texans website right now. So just so you know that as well.
Sorry, we're going to move on to the next portion. Uh-oh, can you all hear me? I'm getting a note that my internet is unstable.
We can
hear you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the ETAS would be created in both English and Spanish, and inserting a choice of language as the first section / question of the application. Any comment on this?
Erica from the Valley. I do know that after we submitted this, one of the members, I can't remember which one, did make a comment that even though it's kind of understood that the two main languages are English and Spanish is what the TASFA will mostly be understood at, there are still some families that in other language that might need it. So we were a little concerned maybe that might be a dilemma. And again, it can be taken under consideration for other potential languages.
Again, and just in my opinion, I think this is a great recommendation, but it's pretty specific about how the Spanish language is going to be presented on the application. I think the recommendation just needs to be that Spanish language translation should be a part of the application. But whether the student is choosing that on the front end of the application and then the entire application is only in Spanish, or whether instructions are provided side by side in English and Spanish, those are nuances that I think whoever is developing the application will have to look at technical capabilities and what provides for the smoothest experience. So again, important recommendation, but it's a little specific this early in the game.
So would you recommend this as a consideration to go in the considerations pile, or I say pile when I think about it, but considerations part of the report rather than a formal recommendation?
I think I think it should be a recommendation that there should be Spanish language translation. How the student gets the Spanish language translation, the how is a consideration, but I think it needs to be a recommendation because it is important.
Yeah, I agree. So what about just saying Spanish language translation should be an option in the application and leave it up to developers to determine the best way? And then under considerations, think about other languages, Vietnamese, French, all the other ones, and then who will translate us also ones. Yeah. Okay. So next item, after the qualifying questions, we recommend a confidentiality statement be featured in large bold font. We recommend requiring a checkbox after this statement in order to continue to the application. You can include FERPA information as well. Any comments on this one?
This is Tammy from SFA. My only recommendation, or maybe not even a recommendation, but just a question for the committee is, should we propose some verbiage? I know it can be changed and altered, but it may be that our intent gets lost if we don't offer them at least something to jump off of when they're creating it. So should we recommend some verbiage?
Erica from the Valley, when we were discussing this, we realized that there are still some families that have some concerns about electronic format, period, whether it's less confidential because it's being sent electronically versus maintaining a PDF version. So we wanted to essentially repeat whatever confidentiality statement is already found, so that they have that sense of, just because you don't see it on the we didn't want them to not see it and then worry that that somehow means it's less than a PDF. So we wanted to essentially take it from there and put it right at the beginning, that they would know from the jump and feel more comfortable with filling out the TASFA. And hopefully over time, we then create a culture of utilizing an TASFA. Maybe not initially, depending on how they feel, but that they feel more comfortable with it, and that they know that that confidentiality will still be maintained even though it's now in an electronic format. But what do you all think?
Is someone trying to talk, because I can't hear them? Like, I hear it's really super low.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but go ahead, Tammy.
I looked at the verbiage a couple of days ago out of curiosity, because I hadn't really looked at that verbiage in a really long time. And the only thing about privacy is it says, I also understand that the information provided on this form will be used only for evaluation of eligibility for state or institutional financial aid. So it's a one-liner. And my 2 cents would be maybe to elaborate a little bit on both forms. I know Erin kind of said earlier we can't really make recommendations on that paper version, but my thought is that parents, if they're nervous about it, that one-liner may not make them any more comfortable with it. So I thought we might just expand it a little bit in general, but that may not be our place. That may be overreaching our mandate. But it's a one-liner. It's pretty short about privacy, so just my 2 cents.
Erica from Valley. I think I might just say Erica. I don't think there's any other Erica in the committee. Then I think maybe we might feel comfortable as essentially agreeing to at least move in that statement from the PDF onto this electronic version. And then perhaps in the consideration pile, we can consider adding more to that statement to add a bit more oomph to it. And that gives us maybe an opportunity or a bit more time to look into the legality of whether we can do that or not. But at least that one liner should not be left out of the electronic TASFA.
So you're reading that statement from right above the signature line on the current TASFA, is that right, Tammy?
Yeah, that's the only place I saw anything regarding that. If it's somewhere else, y'all please let me know.
Well, and when I read that, I don't even interpret that as a assurance of privacy statement. It's a disclaimer saying that this application is for state financial aid and that institutions may have a separate process for institutional financial aid. So it's more of a disclaimer saying this may not be all you have to fill out. To me, it doesn't read as we're not sharing your information. So I think the recommendation, if we want to move forward on this, should be worded as such that there should be the addition of a privacy statement added to the online and paper application that assures the applicant that the state will not be sharing the information in the application with any other entity beyond the institutions that the student indicates on the application. We can make that recommendation, but we ultimately need the coordinating board and the state to certify that that is true, in fact. And so before that gets added to anything, we would need to assure that the information on these applications won't be shared outside of the coordinating board and the institutions that are listed.
And that's a good recommendation. There is a clause in the statute that does talk about data, but like you said, the legality of it, I think I have an interpretation of it. So that's a good recommendation we can put forth.
Great, I like that. And then, yeah, just maybe a consideration to add a checkbox next to that, because I like the idea of the physical, action of doing that. Okay, next we have the eTASFA questions should mirror the PDF TASFA application. We don't recommend utilizing predictive smart logic software, as this can get confusing when students or parents need to change their answer. That was the student focus. Higher Ed said, when switching to the eTASFA, we use the standardized version of the TASFA from College for All Texans as the template for first year, and then adjust second year as needed. And then Claudette had suggested establish the paper TASFA to use as the standard. So I think we're kind of all on board there. How do we feel about the wording of Claudette's? Do you all want to add anything to make it more specific, or do you feel comfortable?
This is Gordon from UT Austin. I had a question on this one. So the current version of what we're calling the paper TASFA doesn't have enough income information with which to use the federal methodology to develop an EFC. So I'm a little bit concerned that our first recommendation would have said that schools have to use either the paper or the electronic, because you're pretty much automatically saying that you're going to have to get 10 tax transcripts from every single one of these students that complete this, because you're not going to have the information that you need to develop an EFC, to develop need to be able to award the state grant funding. Again, we go back to, we can't make recommendations on the paper TASFA, but I'm kind of thinking that the idea of the electronic version was to allow students to self-report information, just like our federal students can on the Fafsa, so they don't have to go through 100% verification.
So
yes, that's a very good point. And in our homegrown online TASFA, we added AGI so that we could calculate an EFC. We still collect the tax documents and confirm that the self-reported AGI matches that and taxes paid. But the paper TASFA currently does not collect that information.
Right, we did the same thing in UT's version, and then we're just making the decision on our verification part.
So can I ask the question of higher ed? Do you see a situation in which a student would not have to undergo verification?
I'm sorry, I missed that question. I missed part of that question.
Sure. I'm just asking if there is, do you think there's a way that we can structure this application to create a situation where a student who was filing TASFA would not undergo verification?
So my understanding is that the state does not does not require verification of any of the information reported on the TASFA. They don't even, you know, currently the TASFA is not even required, but the school is required to calculate an EFC. We do 100% verification, but it's a small population. My thought is that if, you know, much like with the Fafsa, if you're collecting all of the information that you need to calculate an EFC, then a school could set their own verification policy in terms of how many applications that they would select. That's kind of new territory, and I don't know what the state would say about that in terms of, you know, but so to date, they haven't said anything in terms of what you must verify. Now, it does state on the application that students must submit the supporting documents. And generally, if you have documentation in your files that conflicts with other documentation in your files, you have to resolve that conflicting information. So that's why we've always verified 100%.
Yeah, we received the same information from the state as far as the requirement is not for verification, but rather that we must be able to develop an EFC in order to develop need. So the idea was when we created our homegrown TASFA that we wanted students to be able to self-report and then determine whether or not we wanted to verify that income information at that point. Again, just going back to if we mirror what's on the paper TASFA, and it's a requirement that we accept either the paper or the electronic only for this population of students, then all of these students are always going to have to be able to provide tax documents to us.
This is Erica. I get what you're saying. If we have an opportunity here to improve the TASFA so that higher ed institutions can then generate those EFCs and calculate that AGI, as you all were stating earlier, I don't think those of us that are in the high school end of it understood from your point of view how much extra has to go in when they were doing the PDF, and that you guys are implementing your own procedures so that you all can try to reduce or even maybe potentially eliminate verification as you guys see fit. But if you all think a better recommendation would be to mirror maybe some of the other questions, but change and incorporate a different kind of method to allow higher ed to calculate those AGIs and EFCs, then by all means, we want to, the spirit of this committee is to try to make things easier for these families. So I think it just comes down to the student focus subcommittee didn't understand that. So we just figured it was easier to mirror both. But if you're thinking making changes to the TASFA to allow institutions to make those calculations faster or better, or to make them all together, then by all means, we will take your lead when it comes to what you all choose to recommend.
Can I ask a question of Claudette?
Yes.
Hey, do you have any idea if the other committee is recommending updating the paper TASFA to include an AGI.
Well,
Is that
so
something they're considering?
actually, I was just trying to find my notes because it did come up in our discussion, and let's see, met back in July, and we did review. We had recommendations to include adding AGI to the TASFA and also adding taxes paid. I would have to follow up with Leah Smalley to find out where we stand on this. If that's something that's being brought to the board. I've had a hard time keeping my two committees separated and where we are, because I haven't had any contact from that committee since the summer. So I can follow up on that, but I know that that was something discussed for the paper TASFA committee, was adding that. So if that takes place, then we may not have an issue. Then it would be okay to say that the paper TASFA is the basis for the online TASFA.
So what if we say we want to follow the TASFA and also recommend adding two fields, adding the AGI and the taxes paid field?
I think that would be good. And then I can follow up with Leah on where these recommendations stand right now, and let you know, so that you could maybe add that the other committee is also making the same recommendation.
And y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this recommendation really came about when we talked about the time to program, the how complex it would be to do the skip trace logic and things like that. I think it was more of a recommendation on to make it simple and clear and easy. If I can remember our discussion correctly, if you read what we put over there, it's really to make it simple and easy to fill out and not complicated when the student has to go back and make corrections or something like that. I think that's what I recall the discussion being.
That's exactly right, Ed. Yeah, and it was because when students try to make corrections and the skip logic doesn't work, it just creates all sorts of issues. So I put that under considerations. Do not use predictive software, as this can get confusing, but maybe that needs to be included in the actual recommendation.
Paloma, I wanted to say something really quickly. So there's a notification that's going out about the new TASFA tomorrow, and it will include the AGI and taxes. So I just got that email from Chad in our student.
So we're good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trying to jump in to let you guys know that.
Your timing was impeccable.
So I'm gonna go back to what Gordon mentioned and what Ed's, I believe, trying to say is that we are looking at, from my conversations with and from stakeholders and with this group, it seems to be that it seems to be that we have to find, the intent of the bill was to, like some of you have already mentioned, to help and assist students rather than going to every institution and completing different documentation at each institution, to streamline that process for the student. That, to me, was the intent of the bill. So what can be done to make sure that the student has a consistent form that can be used? And we're getting into things that the TASFA may or may not have, but can the committee think about still using a standard form that's been developed and the online version, because that's pretty much what the bill's intent was to do, is not say, I'm going to this institution and have to do XYZ. I'm going to this institution and have to do these processes, but to do one process, either the paper form or the electronic form. If there was a way to, and there is no statute that created the advisory committee for the TASFA. So when we're talking about what is allowed of this committee and allowed of the other committee, those things are a little bit blurred, but I think that we can work together to make sure that those recommendations are streamlined in some way in future meetings. So is there a way to, one, agree that there's some sort of consistent or standard form that can be used? Because right now there is nothing in statute that does say that. So is there a form that can be used and an online version that's an option as well? So if you can think about wording that could allow both of those things rather than going and diverting back to the campus is going to use something that they're already using, that defeats the entire purpose of helping the student. So in that mind, is there some language that can be put for a recommendation that could do that without compromising some of the points that were discussed here shortly?
I think that's a great point. Could, yeah.
We could probably put into a recommendation, because it is our requirement. I think that we can fit this into at least our committee's, scope here. That both the online and the paper TASFA need to be able to provide enough information to calculate an EFC, because that's what we in higher education have to be able to do. So, I mean, I guess at a high level, I don't know, Claudette, that's about as high level as you can get, provide enough information to give us an EFC at higher ed level, because that's what we're going to need in order for a student to be able to one stop at this location, being the electronic or the paper.
So,
but how do we use wording that pushes students to, or institutions towards the electronic, right?
well, essentially, I mean, one of the recommendations early on was when we talked about all the things that you all wanted in the beginning, like what all the stakeholders would want, it was that recommendation is to find a way to include the EFC. I remember early on that was something that was discussed in this committee, that was a recommendation. So it sounds like you all want those details in order to be able to calculate the EFC. So I still believe, and you guys can, I was trying to scroll up, Paloma, to the initial, and I forget, I don't have that. So it's require the institutions of higher education to use the online coordinating board developed TASFA. Now that, if you all as a committee work together to make the recommendations to include the EFC information, that to me is broad enough, because it's not saying that there's any changes now, but there are options and opportunities to go back to the other committee and work together to make those changes to include that EFC information, if that's what your recommendation is. So is that a recommendation that can be done behind the scenes, or does it have to go to the legislature? That's one of the, remember to keep those, I know we're getting into really sticky situations, but in a high level context, does that language currently include what you're saying? If the committee itself is able to work together with the other committees that are in place and consider other stakeholder information to make changes to the TASFA, does that recommendation still hold true that that would be something you could do in using the online and the paper form? Or is there anything else specifically you want to include that allows a little bit more flexibility? I do want to remind you that in the discussions in the panel that came from the state, from the other states, a lot, when I was looking at a high level view, a lot of discussion was that you all wanted to mirror the Fafsa. A lot of you wanted to make sure that the ICER there was an ICER, wanted to make sure that there was a lot of it seemed to be mirror the Fafsa as much as possible. We did hear from one state, California, that has that tool that does mirror the Fafsa almost exactly. The discussion also led to possibly looking at how we might be able to, for them be able to share that information to create that same system within our state. So that's something that that's still up for consideration. I know it's getting to the weeds, but I know that their system does calculate an EFC, does have a lot of the similarities to the Fafsa. So that's something to consider, that can be done. It just, right now we're thinking at a higher level with language that would support a recommendation for the state to use. Now, to your point, Gordon, I want to make sure we address your concern by using the TASFA as a standard. If there's something else that can be added, any language that can be added to kind of flesh that recommendation a little bit more, that would be helpful, because or the consideration that this committee can work with the other committee, the subcommittee, and then the FAFSA advisory committee to create or change that application in order to do that, in order to address your EFC concern. Does that make sense? Sorry, I'm getting messages from all different directions. So, but yeah, that's pretty much.
So if the state,
go ahead.
So if the state aid programs that that use EFC or that are need-based, if it's stated that the EFC should be calculated using federal methodology to calculate that EFC, then I think the language you should use is to ensure that the TASFA collects all data elements necessary to calculate an expected family contribution using federal methodology as outlined by the U.S. Department of Education, because ultimately that's what we need to do, right? And I think by just making a broad recommendation like that, you can ensure that the TASFA will have every element necessary to do that. From my perspective, I'm less concerned with the application itself calculating the EFC, because I don't really have the ability to award any aid in my system based off of an EFC somebody else. Generally, if I can load in the data elements into my system, I can calculate the EFC within my system. And there's a lot of different reasons why I would want to be able to do that. And professional judgment is one where I need to be able to change those data elements within my system. So, I can see putting a broad recommendation of just making sure that the TASFA always includes any data elements needed to calculate an EFC using federal methodology.
For those on
I would agree with Aaron there.
Does that work, Gordon, and other institutions of higher education? Does that language, if you condense this into one recommendation, establish the paper TASFA to use as to establish the paper TASFA that would collect all data necessary to calculate an EFC following federal methodology, and to use as a standard, I guess just trying to flesh that language out, but it seems like the core is there. Are there any other recommendations, and does this address your concern, Gordon?
Yes, that would address my concern. And I think it's just going to be better overall for the student experience here that they can provide us enough information to develop an EFC with federal methodology, because we should all have the ability to bring that information into our systems, whatever systems we're using. And like Aaron said, we have to be able to modify it. So I'm not as concerned either with it calculating on the fly like the FAFSA does, as long as we can just get the appropriate data points.
Something else for consideration or possibly a recommendation is, should we recommend that there be one subcommittee that makes recommendations on any format that the TASFA is provided in? So, do we recommend that this subcommittee take on future recommendations for the paper TASFA? And that's one way to ensure that the same recommendations are made to both. I don't know, Claudette, how to approach that.
Well, my understanding is that the TASFA committee is a subcommittee of the established FAFSA advisory committee.
Mm-hmm.
This one is specifically around the Texas application for state financial aid advisory committee. But the task, like as you mentioned, are again recommendations, and so that and there are rules for that too. So I would say, if we're looking at that, I like that recommendation. Right now, that would really determine again, because there's nothing in statute that says there has to be a subcommittee for the TASFA, because remember, there is no statute establishing the committee. But that's something that we would, I think is a good consideration, to make sure that it's not two separate committees working on two separate things. But this one specifically says application, and it's for the online version. And I think that's where we can streamline that effort in some way.
Okay.
Okay, so how do we feel about this as the overarching recommendation? Establish a paper TASFA that collects all data necessary to calculate an EFC following federal methodology, and use that template as the standard for the eTASFA. And then under considerations, work with TASFA subcommittee to ensure parity as we both work towards an ICER, and not using predictive software. Any comments?
I think as long as not using predictive logic is a consideration, I'm okay with it. I just think that there is a place for it where it's very helpful. I do understand that there are times when students can get into a vicious loop. Happens with the Fafsa too. So just I think just making a consideration of being judicious with the use of script logic and ensuring that it doesn't cause problems with the corrections process. But that's again, way into the weeds. But I wouldn't want to make an overarching statement of never ever use it, because I can think of at least 3 instances where it makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Okay. So moving on, the eTASFA should include helpful pop-ups labeled hints, which explain the question or each section. These hints or tips are already at the beginning of the PDF TASFA. I think they're at the end, but yeah. Does everybody feel good about including those pop-ups?
Yes.
Yeah, I find having the instructions next to each question as they navigate through is much more helpful.
Great. Okay, we are cranking along, y'all. Next, to submit parent and student signatures, 2 signature boxes found at the end of the application, both student and parent, each can sign by dragging their mouse, or a box that they can check. And the higher ed subcommittee suggested keeping the signature process as simple as possible while still ensuring that there is consideration of managing fraud. So how do we consolidate these into a single statement?
I think we could do the second column as the recommendation and the first column as the considerations.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. Next, an Applied Texas Upload portal be created, which students can utilize to submit supplemental documents. Comments?
This is Erica. I just wanted to, that's in our dream wish. If we didn't know or truly understand what is truly capable, what Applied Texas can incorporate, and if being the operative word, this was possible, we thought it would be a great opportunity for higher ed institutions to be able to grab those documents from the same place that they were grabbing the eTASFA. But we understand if that's just not possible, potential, feasible, realistic. But we were wishing.
This is Tammy. I want to put out there, the higher ed committee kind of talked about this and thought it might hurt us more than help us, because it pushes the state toward their mandating kind of verification processes, which they currently don't do. And I know Aaron said earlier that they do verification across the board. I know that we don't do that. We do require just the tax returns, which is not a full verification. It's just data collection. So I feel like maybe mandating this would push us in a direction the higher ed institutions don't necessarily want to go. So my recommendation is not to recommend this, but
No, that's a really interesting point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So it seems like this recommendation could actually push students to be required to submit more in some situations.
And
to do
that
more
definitely,
work.
yeah, that was not the intention that we had at all.
Would this be more of a technical function later on down the road that can be considered? Is that what you guys were imagining?
Yes, essentially a one location where students, whatever documents they were asked for, instead of having to, if they sent their information to 5 institutions, each of those 5 have their own method of how they want documents. Some prefer a general email, some have, you can only do your upload, some only want it by mail. And instead of having to keep track of those different methods to submit documentation, we were hoping there was a centralized location where whatever was requested of them could potentially just be uploaded there, so that in case other institutions also requested the same document, the student didn't have to continue to submit to multiple institutions, and that, you know, tax filing notarized letter of rec, I'm sorry, I've got letters of rec on my mind. That document the student submitted, you know, everyone can tap into it versus it be individually submitted, was our idea.
So
I mean, I think it's good. I think it would definitely have to be optional. I don't think it can be a requirement that the student do this. I think we'd have to talk to the Apply Texas folks, because you're going to run into sort of one and dones like the selective service and the residency questionnaire and stuff like that. And again, you'd have to check with every state institute or every institution to see if they're doing residency the same way. And then when you get into multiple years, you have to have the ability to separate out your years for tax documents or anything that you're requesting at that point. So it would definitely just have to be optional. But I do understand the idea of a co-located source for all the schools to get information from.
I just representing my institution, this would not be ideal for us because it would take away all of the communication that we have with the student in terms of what we have, what we've received. We have a financial aid portal where they can see all of that. We would have to write some communication back and forth with this portal, or it would be a very manual process of somebody going out and pulling in the documents for each student. This would be a huge setback. Like, it would require a heavy lift for us to try to figure out how to make this a better process for the student. I understand that the student would be able to upload one time, but in terms of knowing what each school has, what they're missing, what questions they have, I see a lot of pitfalls with that. Also consider that students don't upload the right document initially, quite often. So what happens if they upload a tax return and it's not signed? Which institution is going to tell the student that? Or are they going to hear it from every institution? Where are they going to upload the signed tax return now? Do they upload it to the same portal? How does the institution know the new document is out there? That, in my mind, a single upload portal really only works if you have every institution set up on the same system with the same student-facing portal with the same processes. You know, I see it being way too cumbersome and actually being a more confusing experience for the student. FAFSA, you know, Department of Ed selects students for verification. They could very easily collect the documentation, but they don't for this very reason. So.
Another thing to consider too on the technical side is that right now, all that has been discussed up to now is ICERs being sent to institutions, or I say ICERs, you know, TASFA ICERs, whatever we're calling them. But if, as Erin so well demonstrated in her comments, if you make this where institutions are trying to go there, you also have to be able to send information from the institutions. So you've made that technical portion way more complicated. So that's just another consideration.
That's a really good point. I guess I'm just wondering maybe about the selective service and the residency affidavit. Would it be useful at all to just for those two documents, not for any other portion, but just for those two things?
I think the selective service statement should be embedded within the application, not a form. It should be a web form. I also think the residency affidavit for our school, that goes through the registrar's office. We never see it in financial aid. So now we're talking about pulling in a different office and changing their process in determining residency, which I can't speak to that. I would have to do a lot more research on the impact there.
That also plays into at my institution, it goes to admissions. So then you're dealing with, okay, at Erin's institution, it goes to one office for residency. At mine, it goes to a different office. So when you talk about getting in the weeds, we're way, way, way in the weeds with trying to figure out that piece.
So maybe tabling this one for a little bit. Okay.
Agree. I completely agree. Yeah,
Yeah, I think you guys are right. These two pieces are more the technical functions of once we have the, for consideration, once you have funding to establish the actual document. So, these are good things to consider in the future. So, because yes, I do understand the portal to upload documents, but as Erin mentioned, it can be more work intended for the institution. So that's something to revisit. And then the other pieces, understanding the way that the institutions receive this data and where it goes within the institution is important. So that, again, is a little bit more, I guess, like you said, too much into the weeds for now. As far as recommendations and considerations, we want to try to keep them as high level and then continue conversations as you all move forward in this work. So I like the conversation. I think, to your point, is this something that you would put in a formal recommendation in the development of of the TASFA? So there still needs to be some discussion to flesh those things out. So I think if you all want to move on with the next recommendation, that would be helpful.
Yeah, that sounds good. And so the next one is kind of along the same vein, and this is about accepting supplemental documents. So higher institutions should accept all the following supplemental documents regardless of preferred method of submission: Texas residency affidavit, selective service verification card, to be submitted anytime before enrollment without penalty, hold, delay in processing, copy of signed income tax or tax transcript, and then this one, if no income tax, a notarized non-tax filing statement letter. So I don't know where this, if maybe based on the document upload, this doesn't fit into the TASFA anymore. Well, what do we all think?
I think just like Ms. Claudette mentioned, I think the point right above this and this one included, I think we should revisit in the future once we have a better understanding of what we're going to have to play with, how much money, what's really realistic and feasible. So I think we should revisit this one in the future. It's well down the line.
Anybody else have anything to add? Okay, we'll move on. This one, in order to adopt future changes to the TASFA, the coordinating board can continue to work with our advisory board to request recommendations for changes for the next 2 years. We can make a suggestion box that's incorporated into the homepage of the coordinating board site. A general email account can be there. And of the board can be in charge of reviewing this. Okay, we can also post on, the coordinating board can also post on social media platforms and send annual or biannual emails to higher ed institutions promoting this option and looking for feedback. So basically, what's the growth? What are the next steps? Any thoughts on this recommendation?
I think this kind of falls under my comment about having a single committee. I don't know how we worded that or if it was alluded to in another. So it was just work with the TASFA subcommittee. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree that for the duration of the term of this committee, and Claudette, is this committee going to continue standing, or was it only in statute for a 3-year term and then?
Currently, it's only a 3-year term, and let's go back to the 2 committees. One of the things that you have to remember is that this committee has a specific directions is to make those recommendations. So if we, what you're suggesting would be trying to revise the scope of this committee's work to add additional, to be that paper TASFA piece, which that doesn't really fall under this specific committee just yet. So like you mentioned, there is another financial aid committee that does have that subcommittee, and they have the knowledge and expertise of the financial aid work groups. So it really just depends on how my suggestion would be that we continue working together with that committee to keep on task, and you and I think Gordon are on those committees, I believe, or I don't know for sure. I think you for sure, Aaron, are in that committee, but one of the things is to bring that information so that we are streamlining efforts rather than making a formal, because what you'll have to do is change statute. You'll have to say, right now, if you want to flip back up, I don't know if you can. I don't want to have to take away from Paloma's work here, so I'm going to read you the statute that was set up earlier. And that is, the board shall adopt procedures to allow a person to complete and submit the Texas application for state financial aid or similar application through electronic submission from in the Apply Texas website is what it says, as it references the section. But so it says that the board shall report the advisory committee's recommendations to the standing committee, and that this subsection, so the subsection that has the advisory committee would expire by 2023. So that's really the scope of work that you all have right now. What will happen is that once this is developed, and there would have to be another review of whether this committee would change into that standard committee, and who that would fall under. I'm just not 100% certain yet, because right now this work is being housed in a different division other than the financial aid division. And I would imagine that it would be essential to make sure that we're in alignment with what the work that they're doing in the financial aid advisory committee, which would include the TASFA. So there's still some things that we have to think about as far as joining the committees or creating one centralized committee where that would be housed and all those things. So those are, again, higher, more weeds than higher level, but that's definitely a good point for future discussion. So to answer your point, it does say that it's going to expire, but remember there's another legislative session that would be coming that we recommend the committee needs to continue. Or you could use this right now to say that's one of the recommendations. We want to continue and change the statute to say, oh no, you lost me?
I can hear you, Claudette.
You can't hear me?
We can hear you.
You're good.
Can't hear you.
Okay. So if you want to use this time to say this is the recommendation that you want to continue your work outside of the expiration, that would be a recommendation to also consider. Like I said, the statute says that this committee would expire in January 2023. If you want to make a recommendation to continue the work, that would be a recommendation you could put in here right now. Did you all hear me with that one?
We did.
Okay.
I think we're all just kind of digesting that recommendation.
So I was trying to read, I didn't, Lisa, can you go ahead and put up the statute really quickly? Let me see if she might be able to. I didn't want to take away from the sharing, but it seems like that would be necessary to show the statute again. So if you see the statute, this is what it says. I mean, this is what you all are obligated to do. And what it says is that the board shall adopt procedures to allow a person to complete and submit the TASFA or similar application through the Applied Texas, because that's a reference to the Applied Texas common application form required by that section. So the board shall appoint the committee, which you all are the committee composed of you all, to assist the board in adopting these procedures required by the section above. So to develop the recommendations for that purpose, then it's submitting those recommendations by January 1, which we are on target. If you all solidify these today, we're on target to get those recommendations to the for approval to our board and then to the legislature. This subsection, so this committee work ends January 1, 2023. So if you are recommending, which is to Erica and the committee that worked on the student focus group, if you're recommending that you want to continue this work, this would be a recommendation to change this language in the statute to say to continue working on the maintenance and development of the application. So that's what the recommendation would be.
I think I can safely say that wasn't our intent. That was definitely not the intent. I think well, maybe I can just speak for myself. Our understanding was, as we continue on in this board, if there if we were going to continue to, over the next 3 years, want or get feedback from our stakeholders, how would we want to do that so that we then continue to work with the coordinating board? But realizing and seeing this now the way that it's written, then I mean, we're doing the legwork now. So I think we're good.
Yes, and you have those 3 years. I mean, you all are continually meeting to address these recommendations. So you have that, you still have that time. So it wasn't clear that that's what your recommendation was. So is it a recommendation or a consideration from what you've put down?
At most, I would say a consideration.
Okay, so I don't know if Paloma, you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I think, yeah, just a consideration that we will continue to collect feedback about the process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Okay, so let's move on. The first-time freshman TASFA application should follow behind the admissions application. Hold on, well, it doesn't matter. In order to avoid the application being forgotten or being completed too soon and sitting. And then the renewal application should be available without completing the admission application first, but to have a fail-safe to ensure that there has been a prior TASFA.
Paloma, are you sharing your screen? Because I'm not seeing it. No. So I know the Higher Education Committee had had a conversation along these lines about, and it's we get down further into that, but just the challenges of when a student hasn't even applied for admission to your school and you receive a financial aid application, trying to match up the admissions application when it comes in later or figure out who it belongs to. So requiring an admissions application be completed first could help with that. The question that we had in the higher education committee, though, was the high school graduation requirement. Not every student has decided to apply to a college by the time they graduate from high school, or by whatever time they have to be cleared for high school graduation. So that's I'm really curious on the high school committee and the student committee, just thoughts on that.
Hey, this is Philip from Dallas, and this is actually something with our scholarship program that we run into a lot of matching and just troubleshooting issues between our pledge application to the admissions application at our partner colleges, and then similarly from admissions to financial aid on the partner college ends. I think what I worry about in terms of if we were to put this recommendation out is, are we inadvertently putting our TASFA students at risk of not submitting those TASFAs early enough to get some of the state financial aid that we know is first come, first serve? And so I think that's I definitely understand and agree that having that admissions application in first is ideal. So that way they can include their ID number on that TASFA and it's much easier to match. But I also think we need to consider from the student side, for those students that are specifically not sure about where they want to go. And maybe, I know we already run into some issues where they think, well, if I don't know where to go, I need to wait until I do before I submit all these applications. And I don't want to get into an area where we're maybe pushing that onto the students more so because of the process that we've set up for them.
Well, in terms of penalizing students, at Texas A&M, I mean, we don't process a financial aid application until a student has applied and been admitted. So there's no ability for us to award financial aid to a student that hasn't applied for admission. And so having the financial aid application come first before the admissions application does not benefit a student in any way. Having them come at the same time would, but having the reverse would not. So I know
this is Tammy from SFA. Our process is exactly the same. A student has to be admitted to our institution before we award financial aid. So I have a feeling that if you ask most of the institutions, that would be the case. A lot of that just has to do with the process. If I don't have a file on a student, if it's not created, I can't award them. So it's
So I do have a quick question for some of the higher eds related to that particular subject. Pardon me, I think about it in terms of our scholarship program, because we do that based on their submission date. And so regardless of when they had that in, as long as they had that submission date that was confirmed by the college, we're good on our end. So I guess the question is, when you're awarding that, definitely understand that colleges won't award any of those financial aid offers until students have actually been admitted. But when you award those, do you award it based off of their admission date in terms of the order that award is going out, or do you award it based on their submission date for their financial aid application, regardless of when they were admitted?
So this raises an excellent question in terms of priority date that I don't think we've discussed in any subcommittee or any of our committees. But in terms of the priority date used for state financial aid, it's the date that the application was submitted to our institution. Mm-hmm. So with this central submission of an online application, if the student didn't select our institution to receive the application, we are not going to, at least, the way we would do it unless told otherwise, we would not use the date the student submitted their application to other institutions. We would use whatever date that application came to Texas A&M. We use the date the financial aid application was submitted. However, if a student is not admitted until later, and we do have some students that are, we call them review admits, and so they don't get admitted initially in our first group, they may be waitlisted and admitted later. If we have already begun awarding, we're still going to consider them as a priority application, but we might be out of funding because we may have already committed all of our funding. So the date is very important because if we're able to request additional funding from the state, that student would still be considered eligible for it because they met the priority date. But it does not, we don't reserve funding for every application in by the priority date. If they haven't been admitted when we begin awarding, they may miss out.
Erin, I have a question for you. Is the priority date, the idea of it going away or changing or shifting, is that being discussed in your other in your other committee?
No, that's what I was saying. This just raised a question in my mind that I hadn't considered until just right now, which is what is the priority date that institutions will use for the application? I don't really see that it needs to change. So, a student can fill out 10 paper TASFAs, and if they only mail off 5 of those to 5 schools and they wait 2 months to mail off the other 5, I don't think those other 5 institutions should be held to the date that they sent the application to the first 5 institutions. It makes sense that it's whenever the school had the application. Would my other higher ed folks agree?
I would agree that on a functional level, I don't know how else we would really process those. If I've got, if the student did a TASFA in, let's say, January 10th, right? That hits priority date, but they don't apply to my school until, let's say, April. Mm-hmm. I can tell you, chances are, that my funds are gone by that point. Now, some of them may recycle when school starts, people who don't show up. And so I may get some back that I can dish back out. But as far as that goes, it's hard to award a student it's impossible to award a student who I don't know about, which is kind of the territory we're getting into at this point. Does the school even know that the student exists, or is interested? And there's really no way for us to know that until we have both pieces, an application piece for admission and a TASFA. So.
Erin, our processing at Texas Tech is similar to yours. For our funding, we base it a lot more heavily on students admitted on or before January 15th. And then we award after that priority date based on a funds available basis. So anything that may be left after that point. But I do agree with that it should be based on the date that we receive it, not the date that anybody else may have received it.
Okay. I think I somewhat derailed the conversation on the recommendation, but it's a good conversation for us to have. But in terms of the recommendation itself, should the financial aid application be contingent on an admissions application being submitted? We need to make a decision on that. For our purposes, we need the student to apply for admission in order for us to do anything with the financial aid application. However, I don't work in a high school and with a diverse population of students, and I don't know, I don't see the benefit in requiring a student to apply for admission to a college just to fill out the financial aid, because the graduation requirement is you have to fill out do a financial aid application. The graduation requirement is not that you have to apply to college, which is an interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah,
but well, that's another conversation. So tying the two together, I feel like is taking the requirement and making it much bigger than it is.
So,
Well, I think, can I just say real quick that those students could do the paper application,
They could.
right?
Yeah.
I like the idea of having the ID number, and it's kind of, you can't have the ID number unless you've submitted an application. That's what I think.
so I was gonna, for the sake of time, because we have other items on the agenda, and I know we probably need to hear from a couple others, and we have a lot to do in a short amount of time. So what would you think is the intent of this recommendation? And one, how would you all manage to implement it? And, in thinking in that context, when you're, creating this recommendation, this is again, a recommendation that would be integrated for the state implementation. So if you're saying that this committee wants to say you have to apply before you can consider financial aid, I think it gets into a very sticky situation, kind of to Paloma's point about the paper TASFA. So do you want to put this more, again, as a consideration and flesh it out to say, address some of the things that you've addressed, or do you want to put it on the back burner? Because remember, this is the high level recommendations that are minimum to make sure that these are addressed at the legislative level. And these again are a little bit more into the weeds but if you want to make a general recommendation, if that's what this committee is doing, you have to consider whether or not, how can you implement it, and how can you enforce and implement something like what you're mentioning as a recommendation?
I think it's a consideration. I don't think we have the answer. I mean, I don't think we have, I don't think we know enough to make a very specific recommendation like this. I think the consideration should be that in the development, the considerations to be given to how schools can match financial aid applications that are received for students that have not applied for admission, or consideration to be made with how schools will match financial aid applications to applicants, just in general, whether they've already applied for admission or whether they haven't applied for admission. How are we going to match that up with the student? And so that may be the Apply Texas ID. There's a lot of there's a lot of technical discussion to be had. So I think it's definitely a consideration. But yeah, I'm definitely not confident making a recommendation yet.
Well, what if we did the recommendation where the student must have the ID from the college? So not necessarily have been accepted, but have the ID from that college.
Well, you're not going to have an ID from Texas A&M until you've applied for admission. So,
right,
so it's like this loop.
It doesn't mean you've been accepted, but you've submitted an application.
You have to have applied.
And well, again, what several were saying, that means that high school counselors would have to across the board for all their kids. I can't even begin to play with you 10-1, 10-5, 10-10. We haven't had it, I need to make sure that all these apps, high school apps, have to be done in order for me to move on to the next. That's going to get sticky, especially since it's a graduation requirement, and there's going to be certain things, especially your high schools that are really big in number, 500, 800, 1,000 kids, seniors strong, that they're trying to kind of maybe keep them all together in big groups, kind of getting things done. You're going to be hard pressed, I think, to find high schools that are going to follow this. And if a kid wants to, and it's a graduation requirement and they just kind of need to get her done, I see high school counselors just getting it through because they need to get the kid graduated.
So maybe we just put in the considerations, the option to include the ID number, right? Because that really combines these last two recommendations from the higher ed board. In order to avoid confusion, we recommend that students include their ID in the school when selecting. So we put that as a consideration. All agree. Any other comment?
I'm going to reread this one. In order to avoid confusion in lost applications, we recommend students include the school ID when selecting institutions. Okay. Yeah, I was just reading it because you brought up a good point, Erica, about the recommendation you all were just talking about, I think would provide some implications to the high school graduation requirement. So if, you know, and it could serve a good purpose of getting students to both realize that there's funding available for them, but also, and for them to apply to college. But we, you know, like you mentioned, there's not enough, you're going based off of assumptions. And so I wouldn't recommend putting in a recommendation for that specific, you know, that kind of specific recommendation. I think that would be a little limiting or presumed limiting to the student and those that are working in the field. So, but there is a need to understand that complexity in matching, as you mentioned. So, because on the Fafsa side, we have issues with matching all the time within our data that's in Apply Texas. So it is necessary, but that's the second part is good to understand how to match and make sure you're getting the students that you need. So that again could be considerations in my opinion. I don't know what you all think, but I think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, I went ahead and moved it over there. I think you're correct. And that takes us to our last one. I think we can all agree. Provide funding for the development and maintenance of the online TASFA. Any comments?
Just copy and paste it over there.
With in like big red flashing letters with exclamation points.
Show me the money GIF right underneath.
Make it rain.
Yes, this is an unfunded mandate. So I do want to bring your attention to some, you know, we were working off of a timeline to get these recommendations. And as I showed you in the statute, I believe this committee has done that. Now the second part is obtaining the funding. The timeline, if we're unable to secure funding, I'm going to let you know the timeline. There is currently not an existing timeline other than trying to mirror the high school graduation requirement. And I was trying to get some more guidance on the bill itself because to me, the timeline was similar to that high school graduation requirement to have this up and running by October 1, 2021 for the 22-23 school year. That without any funding, it's difficult to make those types of timelines. So I did want to turn it over. The next steps are to kind of refine these a little bit more, but also to vote on them. So, but before you all vote, we want to make sure that the language is correct because whatever I'm using is going to go to our board for approval. The other thing is I wanted to go, and Paloma, you can move on to the next agenda item to ask Graham some information about budgeting before you all vote on the recommendations. And I just wanted you to have that one last bit of information. The agenda was a little bit different because I thought we might have another meeting, but we're trying to get this to meet our timeline to the legislature and to get approval for our board. So we had to quickly change focus. So Graham, Paloma, I don't know if you want to go ahead and move on to that one.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and move on to agenda item 6 before we vote. And agenda item 6 is discussion on identifying technical and functional revisions of the Applied Texas system. So this is a standing agenda item from UT Applied Texas team to provide technical and functional revisions to the system. Graham Chapman, do you have any updates for us?
I do, but first I have a selfish question. Can we take another 5-minute break?
I think that's...
Are you all, okay, before you move on to that, we have 10 minutes for, technically, are you all agree? Because I know some people have to drop off, but we need to maintain quorum in order to vote on the recommendations. Are you all comfortable with staying on the call a little longer this time? I guess, Paloma, show of hands to see.
Yes, so do we have a vote of who can stay on the call? I guess a show of hands of who will be able to stay on the call longer if we take a break.
Yeah, so look, Shannon, are you able to stay or no? Okay.
Okay, let me see the next page. Does that mean quorum? I didn't get a count.
So we have 21, so we have
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Courtney, are you able? No, you're not.
9, 10,
Lauren?
13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19.
So you have 14 out of 22. Let's see.
I counted 19. 1, 2.
Oh, 19. Okay, so we have, you can't count Graham, myself, or David Muck. So we're looking at Ed, Lauren, Victoria, thank you guys, Victoria, Erica, Philip, Tammy, Don, Aaron, Oxiel, Abraham, Crystal, Ariala, you, Paloma, Inez, and Gordon. It looks like, yes, I think we do see 1, 2.
Yeah, 14.
Okay, yeah, we have 14. 14 of 20. I gotta make sure. Let's take a break.
Well,
Hold on.
and we'll confirm.
Let me get this really quickly before, because I know I'm sorry, I should know this.
What the quorum is.
Yes, what it is, because we have 20. Let me see. How many do we have?
22, right?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yes, 22. So we have 14 of 22.
So it's 60% is the cut, right? Is it not? Does anybody know?
So we need half plus 1, which would be 11. So
12.
So we have 12. Yeah, we need 12 and we have 14.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, it took me a while to get there, but yes. Okay, as long as you all can come back, because you have to have quorum in order to vote on these recommendations. And then, so Graham, your wish is granted.
11:58, folks. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Courtney. Thank you for your help. And bye, Shannon.
Yeah, bye, y'all. Thank you, guys. So annoying. myself muted the whole time. Okay, so it's 11:58. Let's go ahead and move on. Graham, you got the stage.
Thank you, and thanks for the break. So I want to do two things. One, just sort of reinforce some of the practical considerations here. The timeline that Claudette just referenced would have us going live with this in 366 days. And one of the things that we all talked about when the committee started meeting was, you know, among other things, the importance of allowing time for institution-specific testing as well. So, so clearly, we need to consider getting funding in place. That takes some amount of time. Whether this ends up being a build or a buy, there's sort of time involved in all that, but also some key time involved in institutional testing, which is critical for this. You know, this is the kind of thing that must go live successfully when it goes live, and success will be measured all the way to every door. So a year ago or so, when this legislation was first coming out, I prepared a very high-level budget, and we'll share that just for sort of general awareness. This is the kind of high-level budget that is not considering whether the application is offered in Spanish as well as English, right? I mean, just very high level. And so roughly speaking, over a 4-year period, I estimated this would take a little less than $1 million, sort of around $250,000 a year more on the front. And in this case, the budget assumed that we were developing something. So, you know, there's more involved to stand it up in the first place and do all the testing and so on, and less involved to operate. But operation is important, along with keeping up with, you know, changes year over year. So I just wanted to put that on the table as, you know, kind of a general data point. And I'm happy to field questions if anybody has them.
So this was just mainly high level. There's other costs that are involved, but as an estimate, those were some of the things that we had to think about when you're going to seek funding. So we'll be continuing working with Graham and others to figure out more costs associated with this development. And it just really does consider the homegrown version, like you said, a homegrown or a vendor version, and it really does depend on what that looks like. So the first step, and that's where the recommendation came from about funding. So I don't know if you want to go back to that, if you want to revise it anyway, but funding for that is what we need to continue to even develop it. And that's pretty much where it's an unfunded mandate that we need funding for. So if there's something else that you want to include around the fundings, but that's the main recommendation, was to provide funding to support the development of this integration within Apply Texas.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other comments? Okay, with that, I'm going to just share my screen real quick and go over what we've done. And after that, we'll see if we have a motion to approve. Okay, so I'm going to share. Oh, let me get back over there. Okay, so I've put the funding at the top. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, I didn't click share. That's why. Okay, I went ahead and moved funding to the top, and I just put considerations in another column here to kind of focus us. Recommendation number 1, provide funding for the development and maintenance of the online TASFA. As Graham said, that's $1 million. I don't know if we want to put that in the actual in the actual recommendation.
I'd leave it where it is as a consideration, because fundings, we don't know what we would be able to ask at this point. So it's just mainly asking for an estimate, which Graham has provided, and we'll continue to work with them, but asking for funding is the recommendation.
Number one. Number two, require institutions of higher education to use the online or coordinating board developed TASFA or paper TASFA to verify specific student eligibility for state financial aid. Number three, Spanish language
Can I
translation.
ask you a question about number two? I'm sorry to interrupt. Does that look like there's three options there instead of two, or is it supposed to be three? It's the online or the coordinating board or the paper.
Is that a little clearer, Ed, if I just put a slash between online / coordinating board developed?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a good edit. Okay, to verify student specific eligibility. All right, number three, Spanish language translation should be an option in the application. Number four, should be addition of privacy statement added to online. Well, we don't have to put the end paper in there. That assures that state will not be sharing information with any institution other than those identified by the student. Number five, establish a paper TASFA that collects all data necessary to calculate an EFC following federal methodology and use that template as the standard for the eTASFA. Six, the eTASFA should include helpful pop-ups labeled hints, which explain the questions section. These hints or tips are already at the end of the PDF TASFA. And number seven, keep the signature process as simple as possible while still ensuring that there's consideration of managing fraud.
Hello, Paloma. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Can we, on the pop-ups, and this just may just me, but I would suggest taking out the labeled hints. I don't know that we want to specifically say what the label should be at this point in time, but there should be pop-ups.
Yep, I think that's good. Okay, so these are the recommendations that we've come up with. And
on number four, excuse me, I'm sorry, on number
no, go
four,
ahead.
can we take the should off the front of that? Because it was almost like that was a question. I think we need to put an additional statement of privacy or something like that.
And I wanted to add to that, so the legal interpretation for that, I just wanted to share was, so I had asked to get some clarification about that one section of the statute, and it says the board is allowed to transmit the information confidentially to institutions with the permission of the students. So just to clarify that that was something that was addressed and discussed in a legal standpoint. So
it's in the words, yeah, of the document.
Right. So I do want to go back to number two again, because the way it's written, require institutions of higher education to use, it might need to be rewritten a little bit differently, to use the online coordinating board. I don't know. I'm trying to get rid of the slash is what I was trying to do.
What if it's require institutions of higher education to use the online TASFA and or paper TASFA developed by the coordinating board?
Yeah, I just put eTASFA. Does that work? That's what we're calling it, right?
You might want to put, I don't know if it's technical, so you could put online. I think that's more of an informal, and it's not clear what it is. There's an assumption that people at first glance would know what that means, and I would say that yes, everybody knows what an whatever would be, but I think electronic or online would be better. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I agree.
So do I. I actually like the word online instead of electronic, only because I think it's more universal right now, especially.
And it includes that you can submit it directly versus electronic. Is that an email? I don't know. I think online is perfect too.
I would just add after paper TASFA, the statement developed by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, basically to indicate that the online and the paper, it should be the versions developed by the coordinating board.
That's good detail. Does anybody need me to scroll down to see the other ones?
So on number 5, should we replace eTASFA with online TASFA and make our verbiage universal?
Uniform.
This is Lauren at Navarro High School. I was just thinking we probably should change it as well in the considerations. I just see an eTASFA for number 4. I don't know if it's, I couldn't tell if it was anywhere else, but.
Yeah, and I will clean up the considerations, but I think if we can just nail down the recommendations right now, yeah, it is a good point that I mean, that's very messy over there right now. Y'all can see. Any other comments, additions, edits? Okay, are we ready? Do I have a motion to approve these recommendations? I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Erica, I motion to approve.
Do we have a second?
I'll second. Don from Rankin.
Okay, so members, by show of hands, and I'm sorry, who was that second? I didn't write it down.
It was Don Hilton.
Okay. Okay, by show of hands, raise your hands whether you're voting for or against. Those in favor of approving these recommendations, raise your hand and say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Okay, I think the motion passes. Hey, I think we can move on to agenda item number 7. That's an update on HP3.
Before you move on, I'm sorry. So thank you for that. We will be taking these to the board for approval. They will be a bulleted list, but a formal report will go to the legislature. So the recommendations that you provided will be going on to the board for approval. That's the next step. The meeting should be October 22nd, if I can squeeze it in, but that's what the next step will be. Although this committee is scheduled to meet until 2023, it could convene earlier than that or disband earlier than that. Should there not need any further discussion moving forward. So just know that you don't have that whole entire pipeline, but just know that the timeline is going to be just for the recommendations at this point, and that's the task. So I think you've accomplished your goal as a committee. And that's the next step. So yay, congratulations. And I'll let Paloma go on to the next agenda item.
Okay. This is an update on HP3 Fafsa Advisory Committee. This item is a standing item on the agenda to allow for updates regarding House Bill 3 Fafsa high school graduation requirements. Claudette, do you have an update for us?
I've been meeting with the committee, and I know the next item for discussion is that they're setting aside its own data, looking or exploring data. I do have a guest here that I haven't talked to her about this, but I don't know, Jessica, if you're available, do you want to share what the next meeting around data will be, just to align those efforts?
Hi everyone, I've been video off just to not be distracting as a non-member in your conversation, so you could focus on one another. I can certainly try. We've introduced a couple of data components to the financial aid graduation requirement committee that the Texas Education Agency is conducting. And I should briefly introduce myself. Jessica Snyder. I am the Director of Special Projects within the Curriculum Standards and Student Support Division at TEA. And I am a co-facilitator of that advisory committee with my colleague Alexis Bowserman, who's joined you for some other meetings. But we essentially, there's a reporting requirement for the House Bill 3 graduation requirement that districts, we know they'll have to monitor financial aid application completion to determine and establish that students have met that graduation requirement and to graduate them. But there's also a reporting requirement for them to report the number of students who have met that graduation requirement, either by completing an application, and it doesn't indicate which one, or who have met that graduation requirement by opting out. And I don't know if this committee is familiar, but there is an exception to the financial aid application. There are 3 ways a student can opt out. Either themselves, if they're over 18 or emancipated, with authorization from a parent to decline, or with authorization for a counselor to decline for good cause. And so those 2 sets of numbers, an application, again, not which one, or an exception, will be reported to TEA. And so we started with the committee by sharing with them what are the data elements that will be built into PEIMS in order to report that information. And then in a follow-up meeting, we shared with them what information is currently available, what we have called the initial solution to reporting this data, both monitoring and ultimately reporting this information to TEA, which is the information for Fafsa that's currently available within the Applied Texas Counselor Suite. So we think they can use that data to both monitor their students and then ultimately to transfer that information into a student information system for the reporting requirement. But what we've talked about in the last meeting and what we'll bring up with this kind of data subcommittee is there's 2 other components of that recording that will need to be monitored and then integrated with the FAFSA data to report, which is if a student completed a TASFA, which we're not collecting that information, but it is an application. So they would need to go into that bucket for reporting that they completed an application. And then they've also got this opt-out option, which they'll need to integrate into their student information system so that they can report to one of those 2 options in PEIMS. So we'll talk a little bit with them about that additional consideration is that the districts, at this point, we're talking to them more about just districts being aware of what they're going to need to collect, monitor, and ultimately report. And again, just going through with them, what are the current mechanisms in place, meaning the counselor suite for FAFSA data, and what mechanisms or processes they're going to need to establish and develop locally to collect, maintain, and then ultimately report those other 2 pieces of information. So that's one thought I had as you were talking today is what will be the method of proof that students will have to indicate to a counselor that they've completed the TASFA. So that's something we'll certainly be discussing, and as you move forward with the creation of, or as someone moves forward with the creation of the electronic or online TASFA, that's a piece or component that we'll be very interested in as well, and in how we can also verify that a student has done that. So that's essentially what we'll be talking with the data subcommittee about in a nutshell. Again, we've already had some of those conversations with the larger group, and then also some potential other options for streamlining or automizing the data transmission, because right now counselors are pulling from the counselor suite, a flat file. There needs to be a way to integrate or automate that process. We like to investigate and explore getting that into the SIS. So it's not someone copying and pasting information from an Excel spreadsheet. So that's another potential capability or functionality that we'll talk to the group with further.
Thank you, Jessica. And I put you on the spot, but I thought you'd be the best person to provide that update on the data, because I know I've been part of those discussions, and so that's helpful that you were able to share that with the committee. As this work is moving forward, I know we've continually brought the option of being able to track TASFAs as well, mainly to streamline efforts with this purpose for data collection, so that counselors and school districts know that the student is meeting the graduation requirement in general. Those are all, again, things that we're having discussions at making sure that we're aligning our efforts as well. And if this, with the development, hopefully with an e-TASFA, there might be some opportunity to do something similar to how the data is collected in the counselor suite currently. And that's something that along the way, we will continue to discuss.
Can I ask a question, just in terms of the language of this bill and what satisfies the requirement? So I know the intent is for the student to complete a financial aid application so that they can have awareness of what financial aid might be available for them should they choose to go to college. Does the student completing a paper TASFA and giving it to their high school counselor satisfy this requirement in terms of the way it's written? Or does it have to actually be submitted to an institute of higher education?
So I think that the statute, and apologies, I don't have it in front of me, actually says complete and submit. I have to verify that. But I will say that the committee, that's one of the last conversations for this committee to have. Their charge is to assist, again, not direct language from statute, with the adoption of commissioners' rules, and the commissioners' rules, or make recommendations, I think is what it is for commissioners' rules. And one of the requirements for the commissioners' rules is the method that a student would prove that they have. And again, it's going to matter, completed or submitted. I think it says both, the application. So I'm sorry that I'm not able to fully answer your question. I'll kind of, after I stop talking, look and see. I'm sure I have a copy of the statute pretty nearby, but I think it's going to include a submission component and not just that they've filled it out.
So something that I'm sure is being discussed is if a paper application is submitted to an institution of higher education, how does that data get recorded anywhere else? Because currently we're not reporting that information back to Apply Texas or to the coordinating board in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, so our committee is making recommendations that a school should be required to accept the paper TASFA or the online TASFA. So if they're able to accept the paper TASFA, then how does that data get reported back to the districts?
It's a good question. And so that's a conversation. I was thinking about that very much as you were talking about this method of proof and where that might fit in with the paper version, other than a counselor mailing it themselves or witnessing. And so those are just discussions the group hasn't had yet. Okay. But I guess we're kind of coming in not at the optimal time to collect your input on that. But we have similar expertise in that committee that will be able to weigh in.
And those are conversations because currently they're, like, to your point, Erin, there is nothing that's tracking those TASFAs. So if the requirement was in place now, we'd have to find a way to do that, and it would probably be the counselors capturing data and reporting it in some way. So that's what the discussions are going to be in these committees, and so that's the next step. So now we know that the paper and recommendation would be the paper and the electronic version will be captured, and what that might look like in reporting for the requirement needs to be discussed a little in greater detail. So that's pretty much where we are. But knowing that this might take longer than expected to create, we'd probably have to talk about what are the alternatives in the paper version continuing and how to track that. So those are some things that have to be discussed along the lines of this development.
I did pull up the statute. It's completed and submitted. It is completed and submitted.
There was a little piece about, when I was thinking about your question, Erin, we're talking about what does submitted mean? Does it mean every single documentation along with it? And from our understanding, and Jessica, I don't know if you know, but I know in conversations with Alexis, it says completed and submitted. So that's it. If the student has done those things, there's no follow-up to say that they've included every other document. It's just that it's been submitted.
It doesn't have to mean that verification and all of those steps have been completed, because we can't ensure that a student would be able to complete all those in time for graduation. And we certainly wouldn't want that to prevent a student from doing so. And so that's very much a part of our messaging, and some of the toolkits we're developing is that counselors, while they've met the graduation requirement, there's still very much encouraged to ensure that financial aid package, all of the steps to secure that financial aid package have also been completed, but that is not a component of the graduation requirement.
Oh, this is Erica. I'm so glad that's being taken into account, because I can say there is one institution that I know of that has their internal procedures as not even touching TASFAs until the summer. They don't look at them. They don't select for they don't even begin. So by the time the student starts the verification process, counselors are long and gone, and they feel very much alone when it comes to working with that particular campus. So I'm glad, because it would significantly impact, I know, some schools, some high schools that have to end up dealing with some higher eds that have very different procedures in place when it comes to how they deal with their TASFA kiddos.
And I believe that's it. Erica or Jessica or anyone else have any other comment before we finish this agenda item? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
So agenda item 8 is discussion of potential agenda items for our next meeting date.
So I'll give you some context. I thought we might have another meeting available until, like, most recently, where I was told we had to get these done today. So you all have an option of meeting again, but it would be just to meet one last time. We can table this and see if another meeting is necessary, and we can coordinate that offline. But for the purposes of, because we had already put this out for the Texas Register for our open meeting, this was already an agenda item. So I defer to you and think about what you want to do. If you want to meet again, if you feel it's necessary, or if you want to coordinate that offline and see if we will take another poll to do that.
Table it.
Yeah, she beat me to it. Yes, I agree. Table it, and we can just poll later.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll send a doodle poll out. We probably won't. I mean, it sounds like you guys have already met the requirement and have completed your task. If you want to do a debrief meeting, that can come back around once the report is submitted and you want to see it. But we can discuss that offline, and that would, so technically this would be the last meeting, unless you want to meet again, and that is strictly up to you. We'll send out a doodle poll to kind of assess that and see what dates might be available if you do want to continue meeting. So thank you all. I guess we're going to, before we close, I'm going to reiterate again, you all did a great job in such a short time. Committees take more than a year, from my understanding, to come up with to really think things through. So I appreciate your commitment and willingness to stick with us and meet this expedited timeline. So these next steps are, these recommendations will be going to our committee or to our board for approval on October 22nd. And at that point, there is a formal report that'll go to the legislature that explains the timing, it explains the considerations, it'll explain the dates that we met, just to kind of map out what the work was, and then that would go to the board. So, I mean, to the legislature. So I thank you all for your work. Shannon's not here, but Paloma, you've done an amazing job today in getting us on task. So we're gonna clap for Paloma. And I'm gonna clap for all of you, and to Tammy for my note taking, as always. And thank you for our guest who came today. We did this in such a short amount of time, like it's almost surreal, but I thank you all again for all your work. If you have any other questions about the next steps in the process, please email me. But I said, we'll send out a doodle poll to see if you all want to continue meeting for a final brief and see what kind of a response we have for another meeting. But again, you all don't have to meet necessarily any longer because you've completed your task. So we will talk through that more offline, but I appreciate all your work again. And we thank you to everyone that has made that commitment to stay with us. And I think that's all I have to say.
So this concludes the business of the Texas application for State Financial Aid Advisory Committee for September 30th, 2020. If there's no further discussion, do we have a motion for adjournment?
Tammy Mitchum motions for adjournment. Erica, we're always tied.
We're on it, sister. Yes.
Does somebody want to take the second?
I will second. Erica seconds.
Members, raise your hands if you are in favor and say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Motion passes. This meeting is adjourned. Congratulations, good work. The time is 12:28.
Good work. Thank you.
Yay. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.